call us to order. I've been reminded to remind you that this meeting is subject to the Open Records Act and Open Meetings Act, and that it's also being videoed, so watch yourself. And recorded. Your microphones usually come turned off, and I would recommend personally leaving them that way until you actually have something to say. If you're anything like me, I have a tendency to talk to myself. We don't necessarily need to have that recorded. And if McGregor, do you have any words of welcome?
Well, I would just like to say that usually some of my best ideas come when I'm talking to myself. At least they sound better to me. So we'll go from there. But anyway, thank you all very much. I know we have several new folks on the committee, and I welcome you to the coordinating board and to a 3-year life cycle of work and opportunity to provide input to the coordinating board and opportunity to affect the way that we operate at the undergraduate level. And so we're very glad to have you here. And we've got several significant topics on here that we're looking forward to getting your guidance and recommendations on. And so I look forward to that. And I want to thank my staff for getting this all put together and planned out. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Terry?
Well, I'm Terry Walsh. I'm Terry Walsh from San Antonio College, and I would also like to welcome new and returning members. And if we could, why don't we go around the room and introduce ourselves? And David.
I'm Dave Below. I'm Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Texas A&M Corpus Christi.
And Terry, do you? Oh, okay. I'm Catherine. Oh, sorry. I'm Catherine Parsoneau. I'm a Senior Program Director here in the Division of Workforce, Academic Affairs, and Research, and I have served as staff support for this advisory committee since it was convened in November of 2006. I'm really glad to be here with you.
My name is Lucy Heston. I'm the Assistant Director in Workforce, Academic Affairs, and Research, and I assist Catherine with UEAC.
Hi, I'm Janet Armitage from St. Mary's University.
Oh, sure.
Hi, I'm Diane Taylor. I'm an Assistant Vice President in Academic Affairs at Tarleton State.
Good morning. My name is Linda Villanueva. I'm the Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs at Brazosport College.
Well, good morning. My name is Itzel Figueroa, and I'm currently a junior student from the University of Texas at El Paso and also a peer career advisor for the university.
Hi, I'm Jana Arney, Associate Provost, University of Texas at Brownsville for Faculty and Academic Affairs.
Good morning. I'm James Goman. I'm an Assistant Director in the Division of Workforce, Academic Affairs, and Research. And I mostly deal with graduate issues, but I'm very eager to hear what you folks have to say on the subjects before you today.
I'm Donna Adkins from Coastal Bend College at the Kingsville campus.
Hi, I'm Tony Stanzo from Grayson College, and I am here for Dr. McMillan, Jeremy McMillan, who contacted me about 5 o'clock this morning and asked if I could fly in from Dallas to take his place.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Herman. I'm Assistant Dean for Academic Initiatives in the School of Undergraduate Studies at UT Austin, and I'm here for Larry Abram, who's Interim Dean of Undergraduate Studies.
I'm Linda Gann from Ranger College, and I'm a Professor of Business and also QEP Director.
I'm Larry King from Stephen F. Austin State University. I'm a Professor of Communication, and I'm also the Director of Student Learning and Institutional Assessment.
I'm Danny Day from Collin College, the Associate VP for Teaching and Learning.
Callie from the University of Texas at Tyler, and I chair the Communication Department.
I'm Celia Williamson from the University of North Texas. I'm the Vice Provost for Educational Innovation.
Good morning. I'm Debbie Cottrell. I'm Vice President for Academic Affairs at Texas Lutheran University.
Good morning. Jim Croct. I'm Assistant Provost for Undergraduate Studies at Texas A&M, substituting for Dr. Ann Kennemer, who is in the Philippines today.
Good morning. I'm Mark Smith, Vice President of Educational Services at Temple College.
Christopher Ritzy from Sul Ross State University, Chair of the Biology Department.
Fred Hills, McLennan Community College, Dean of Arts and Sciences.
And I'm McGregor Stevenson, the Assistant Commissioner for Workforce Academic Affairs and Research here at the Coordinating Board.
So we want to thank you all, and we also want to thank our guests. We have two guests who will be joining the UEAC in January, Kristen Croyle and Nancy Martin, and so we're happy to welcome them. The UEAC has 22 regular serving members, 10 from community colleges, 10 from universities, and 2 from the ICUT schools. And we also have a non-voting student member. Because the UEAC had worked so hard for several years and met 5 or 6 times a year, they did not meet last year very much. They had one meeting in March, and we did not appoint new members. But now we have reappointed or appointed new members, and we've got a whole bunch of new people. There are 11 new members today. And we will have 7 more members joining us as new members after the first of the year. We have 4 members who will be continuing their service through August 31st of 2013, David and Terry, and Jeremy McMillan, who we're happy sent us a proxy so you can take the good word back to him. And Larry Abram from UT Austin. And Jeanette, thank you very much for representing Larry. So the next item on the agenda is the election of co-chairs. Among the people who have rotated off the committee recently are both the co-chairs of the committee. In any committee that deals with undergraduate education, we try to represent the two leading stakeholders, which are, of course, community colleges and universities, by having co-chairs. So the next item, and I know that the convening co-chairs here, and we're very grateful to them, are going to accept nominations for a co-chair at least through August of 2013. And the reason that I informed you about the 4 people who will be continuing that long is that you may want to think about, veteran versus novice when you make your nominations. But the nominations can be anyone on the committee. So if one of you wants to handle that.
Are there any nominations for co-chair? Are there other nominations?
Please.
Well, let's see.
You can ask for a motion.
Is there a motion to close nominations?
So moved.
And a second?
I'll second.
Okay. So it has been, motion has been made that David and I continue until August of 2013 as co-chairs. And it's been made and seconded. Are there any objections, or we need to vote on that? Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? So the motion carries.
Congratulations.
Thanks, I guess.
Now you really do have to chair the meeting.
So if one of you want.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did that wrong.
Has everyone had an opportunity to look at the meeting summary for March 30th, 2012? And if you need any time to look at that, not so much minutes as it is a summary. I know that we have so many new members that most of you are not going to have much in the way of an objection. Second? All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Catherine?
So we're going to be very efficient today, and that's terrific. I really, really appreciate that. Agenda item 5 has to do with the implementation of reverse transfer as required by a bill that was passed during the last legislative session, and I included a hyperlink in the agenda that you all received so that you could look at that statute if you wanted to. McGregor, do you want to lay this out, or do you want us to do it?
I don't mind at all. Last session, the legislature passed a bill that required universities to send to request of students who had attained 90 semester credit hours, 30 of which came from a lower division institution, if they would like to have their transcript sent back to the community college or technical college of origin for the purposes of receiving an associate's degree. The universities were mandated to do that. The community colleges who received the transcripts had then the opportunity to grant that associate's degree, and it was a permissive action. It was not mandated. Now, I believe that there have been some questions come up in terms of the level of work that's required to accomplish this and the level of interaction between the universities and the community colleges with regard to how the transcripts are being sent back and forth. There have also been some questions raised about whether or not 90 hours is the appropriate number and whether or not 30 hours was the right number for that as well. I will tell you that when the statute was being written, that the reason it was looked at for 90 semester credit hours was so that there would be only one time when the university had to submit the transcript back to the community college, and it would be at such a point in time as to most likely cover any of the courses outstanding in the associate's degree, that the student would then be eligible from those 90 hours to get the degree without any additional courses. In looking at it, it was felt that, setting it at 75, just depending, you kind of start getting into a question of whether or not that's going to cover enough of the hours for the degree at the community or technical college. However, there has been some interest among the community colleges, at least expressed to me. Whether that's a large number or not, I'll leave it up to you. But there has been some interest among the community colleges to offer very broad and general associate degrees that could encompass pretty much anything in terms of what was being transferred back from the universities. And so perhaps the 90 hours was too high, and that it might serve as a better encouragement if it was done at 75 or 81 or whatever the number is. But we wanted to put it on the agenda and just kind of get some dialogue with you all in terms of maybe some of the challenges that both universities are facing with obtaining the permission from the students or in getting the transcripts back to the community colleges in an effective and efficient way. And then also on the community college side in terms of how you're handling hopefully a deluge of transcripts for potential review, but also recognizing that there's a significant amount of work involved in that. So really this is just opening it up for discussion simply because several of these issues had been raised. I will say that the Apply Texas applications are being revised. I was at a conference in Chicago and just happened over here a conversation with the FERPA director, the director of the FERPA compliance office, who was indicating that you could do an opt-out for the permission for the reverse transfer. And we finally got that in writing from FERPA, and we're finally able to work through some questions from UT's legal office, and UT manages the Apply Texas programming. And so we are going to be including that in the Apply Texas applications. And so the student's application will come pre-filled with, yes, I want to transfer my credits back. And they will have to affirmatively click on no should they choose not to do that. So we're hoping that prospectively it's now going to make it much easier for the institutions to identify those students who are willing to reverse transfer. Celia?
And for students who are already in the process and therefore aren't going to check Apply Texas at this point, it's okay for us to lean on that FERPA ruling that we could send an opt-out letter to students?
I think that's a little different, because with the Apply Texas application, they are actually signing that. They're electronically approving it. If you send them an opt-out letter, they have never accepted that, even though it was pre-populated. So without rendering you a legal opinion, which I will leave to your legal counsel, I would say that that would probably present some challenges.
Thank you.
So really, I'll just throw it open to you. Maybe we can start with the discussion of the universities and any challenges the universities are facing, or that they are having to deal with in trying to implement this, and what we might do to help.
I'd also like to say we have Jose Rios and Andrew Lofters with us, and Jose is our staff point person for Apply Texas, and Andrew has been working with him, and they may have some information to share also.
You got anything, Jose? Okay. Great. The universities don't have any problems. Perfect. Let's.
One thing that I noticed when I was working on the community college transfer student report for this year, which is mandated in a rider in the appropriations bill, we send out a survey to all of the universities. This is a report that really looks at how transfer students fare once they have transferred into a university, what programs universities have in place to encourage and assist students who transfer in succeeding and completing their degrees. And one of the questions that we ask on that survey has to do with reverse transfer, and we explain what reverse transfer is, and then ask each institution, how many colleges did your institution send transcripts back to for the purpose of reverse transfer during the past year? And it was an interesting set of responses, because some institutions said 0, and one institution, Texas A&M Commerce, said they had sent, was it Commerce? Said they had sent transcripts to 36 community colleges. And we didn't ask how many transcripts, we asked how many colleges. So we have some information, at least very tentative about that, that might help us know which institutions are actually engaging in this deliberately. This is a statute that will affect people as of the fall of 12, so this semester that we're in. But a number of institutions have already been doing this because they felt it was a good practice. So I'll just add that into the mix.
And I will kind of brag on Sam Houston State, which has been working on this for a number of years. But last year they did over 2,500. Their community college partners awarded over 2,500 associate's degrees based upon reverse transfer. Now, I don't know about any of y'all, but that had sure helped the numbers of pretty much any community college in here. So just something to think about. We have also posted on the website copies of the agreement between a community college and Sam Houston State in terms of how they're going to conduct the transfer. And so if you're interested in that, that's also available on our website. Sure.
Sorry about that. Especially if the hours are reduced to 75, is there any concern that a student, in realizing that he or she can get an associate's degree, that the person was unaware of, might stop at that and not proceed to graduate from the university with a bachelor's degree?
From my perspective, I don't have that concern because they've already taken the step to the university, and usually it's prior to taking that step that we see a significant amount of attrition. So I think from our perspective, we see this as an added incentive for them to continue on in that, wow, I've accomplished something, I am making progress in my education. And so I guess at least from my perspective, that would be the analysis. And I don't know that does anybody know of any research that's been done in terms of any higher attrition among students who got reverse transfer associate degrees? I haven't seen anything like that.
I haven't seen research, but I can tell you at the community college level, helping students along, like for instance, they complete their first year, to have a certificate is a boost for them to keep pushing forward. When they get to 2 years, it's a boost to get them going forward. So that's the recognition along the way. So I would say it's probably the opposite, that having the associate is, at least our experience has been a real positive. Students have gone back and excited about it and then kept going.
And I think usually it's such a surprise, for those students who go, wow, wait a minute, I can go ahead and get my associate's degree now, even though I'm at the university. And so I think it is something that's a very positive outcome for the student.
Are you suggesting that the initiative for this should be on the university or on the student?
The statute actually requires it to be of the university. So the university is required upon a student, the semester after a student hits 90 hours, the university needs to go back and look and see whether, for any student who had 30 hours at a community college, once they attain 90 semester credit hours, the university is obligated to then send an email, contact that student in a written format, asking them if they are willing to reverse transfer to send their transcript back to the community college.
But we just don't do it automatically for the student. We send them an invitation to do it, but we wouldn't do that just automatically for the student.
Correct. Unless you have already received permission, the student has already given indication that they approve the use of their transcript in that way. For FERPA purposes, you would need to get their authorization. Sure.
So,
Jim and then Donna.
I'm just wondering, as a community college person, are the community colleges notified of these students, or how do we find out that they've been invited so that we can also invite them?
I'm not sure what the exact answer is, but I can tell you that we've been a partner with Sam Houston State University, and this process has worked extremely well for us at Brazos Port College. And it's one I would highly encourage you. The contact there that has kind of spearheaded this has made it so extremely easy for us to have this reverse transfer in place. And so I would just contact them, and they're going to make it so easy for you. Now, the registrar has more work to do, but this is a good problem to have in our viewpoint. And we actually had some of the students who were already transferred actually walk in graduation. Now, of course, it didn't hurt that some of them got some free Kindles in graduation, but it was actually a very big plus for us.
I think the answer is you would be notified once the university identified those students who were willing to have their transcript sent back, and then the university would send the transcript back. Now, I don't know how that relationship or how that communication takes place.
So we could potentially still lose some who choose not to and maybe don't understand the process.
Absolutely. But I think we at least took a step in the right direction, even if we're still going to lose some. Yes, sir.
We've been having a discussion. Sorry, we've been having a discussion about whether or not we could just award the transcript without the student even necessarily applying for it.
Based on
based on the reverse transcript being sent back.
As long as the student's notified up front, either through the Apply Texas application or through whatever mechanism you use, where they are authorizing you to send the transcript back to the community college, then you don't have to notify them of graduation or anything like that. But, I mean, notifying them that they've received the associate's degree, I would think would be a positive step.
One of the things we do at Temple College, whenever we form an articulation agreement, we always have a reverse transfer statement in that articulation agreement. So that's one of the ways that if they're going to use that articulation agreement, that they're notified.
Just from my perspective, I think you want the student to know that they've gotten that associate's degree. I don't think we want to just award it for our numbers.
Yeah. Texas A&M decided to really pursue this last summer, and there was quite a bit of programming work to get our student information system in the shape that we could kick those numbers out fairly well. But it looks like it's a very easy process now that all that is completed. The first round of notifications we sent out to students had about a 43% return of those students who were eligible. So we're going to up the marketing of that just a little bit and try to figure out some different ways of doing that permission at new student conferences rather than wait until they actually hit the 90 hours. We did have a couple of face-to-face meetings with Blinn this summer because they're our largest transfer source. And we discovered that timing is important for both campuses. I know that's not always possible, might not be able to get every representative of every community college together with all of the institutions that they serve. But Blinn indicated that there were certain times during the semester they did not want a bunch of transcripts dumped into their hopper, and it's difficult for A&M to generate them at certain time periods. The last point was that it seemed like 90 hours was a fairly good number of hours in our situation, because we have some majors, especially the highly technical majors, maybe science and certainly engineering, and some of the majors in the College of Agriculture, where students really they try to get the courses in their major immediately when they come on campus, and they try to put some of the core curriculum courses off. So sometimes they are a little bit later. 90 is a good catch point for us.
And I think that's a great point, because if you look at the Engineering Transfer Compact, a lot of those core curriculum courses are spread quite a ways into their junior and even parts of their senior year. So, I mean, the 90-hour question is one that, I think there's some challenges to trying to lower it if we're going to try and be as inclusive as we can without doing this multiple times. And I don't think anybody wants to do it multiple times. And Jim raises a good point in terms of the timing of this. The statute is not nonspecific with regard to when this has to happen or how frequently. So in terms of providing the data, as soon as that student gets to 90 hours, the analysis needs to be done, and the university needs to send it back as soon as they can. But it's up to the community college then to act as to whether or not they're going to award a degree. And so the timing on that end is not as critical as upon reaching 90 hours. And so I think that may give the community colleges a bit more flexibility in terms of if they're in the middle of their data runs or registration or those kind of things, it's eating up a lot of staff time, they could delay that review until I won't say there's a slack time, but a less busy time.
Did I understand? I think the question was out there, can a community college award an associate degree without the student applying for graduation?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no requirement for that. The only thing I think we want to make sure of is that they're at least notified that this is the process. And that's done with getting the FERPA release. I think that covers it. But obviously, I would encourage you to notify the students that they got the degree or that they're eligible to get the degree. So, sorry, let me go over here. Itzel.
Thank you. As a student, I know a lot of us take our basics or are required to take our basic core the first 2 years. Therefore, I think a 90-hour, it's a good, reasonable amount of credits needed for an associate's, because we don't want a lot of students just getting an associate's for completing their basic courses where they haven't really engaged in their actual major during those first 2 years. So reaching up to an extra year, that will give them the opportunity to actually learn a little bit more about what the degree is and what they want to do, and also at the same time give them the opportunity to see if this is really what they want to accomplish, because we do have a lot of students who during their third, even their fourth year of college are transferring into different colleges or changing their majors because they're still not decided with what they want to do.
Sure. Thank you very much. Sue, I'm sorry. I'm trying to take over the meeting. I apologize.
Please do. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about this to say a whole lot, but my understanding is that there's a very small group of students for whom receiving, international particularly, for whom receiving that degree has some potential negative impact in terms of their immigration status and that sort of thing. So we just need to be careful about awarding it if they're not aware of the award, because and that's not a large number of students at all, but we certainly wouldn't want to put a student at a disadvantage. And I think there is an immigration issue with potentially receiving the degree if the student hasn't dealt with some of the immigration issues in that transfer forward.
Does anybody else have any knowledge of that? Because that's been kind of mentioned in passing.
And I don't know enough to speak authoritatively. I've just had some questions raised about that.
I think El Paso had one student in the past 3 or 4 years that happened, but they just reversed the award. So they awarded the degree or the associates, and they took it back because it wasn't immigration. It was based on eligibility of a scholarship. So that one out of,
several thousand at El Paso.
a lot of, I think it's like more than 10,000. So it's very small.
Thank you for bringing that up, then.
And then again, the student, especially with international students, they should know they know those issues. So they, at the time that they're signing the FERPA certification, they know not to click yes.
Right, and once they are asked and respond, that's their decision. Mm-hmm. My concern is if we ended up awarding degrees and the student wasn't aware of the award, that we might run into that with a few students. And granted, it is not many at all, but I just hate to put any student in a situation where we disadvantage them.
Yeah, and then again, you can always take it back, and like El Paso did.
Just wondering, if a student is not core complete, but is at 75 or 90 hours, and realizes that he or she can get an associate's degree by taking a few more hours, isn't it possible that the student might choose to go back to the junior college in order to receive the associate degree and leave the university to do that? Does it pose potential problems with retention for universities?
I wouldn't think so, simply because once the student's transferred, they've already acknowledged that they're going to have to complete the remainder of the degree, including the complete core curriculum, after transferring. So I don't think that the notification that they would be eligible for an associate's degree if they completed some additional credits is going to cause them to change where they're obtaining those credits, because they'd still have to complete those credits for their baccalaureate degree anyway.
There's also a rule in the core curriculum part of the coordinating board rules that says that a student is responsible, and this is from the statute, a student is responsible if they transfer without completing the core. They become responsible for completing the remaining requirements that they have not already fulfilled at the institution to which they transfer. And we have added in the rules an additional statement that a student may only be a degree-seeking student at one institution. An example is a student who has completed a number of credits at a community college, transfers to your university, and then wants to take some summer courses at the community college because they think it will advantage them in some way. But they're already enrolled with you for the upcoming fall. That doesn't mean that they stop being your student and become a degree-seeking student at the college and then come back and become a degree-seeking student with you unless we decide to change those rules.
Other comments about reverse transfer? Any challenges that you all would like to raise? The reason I'm asking is as we're coming into legislative session, the 90-hour issue may come into question, as may the 30-hour. And I'm not hearing a lot of folks, raising some concerns with those. And from my perspective, we may almost want to give this a test run for a couple years. Because I think if we lower it to 75 or some other number below 90, you're expanding significantly the number of transcripts that are going to have to be sent back, at least in that first initial batch before you kind of get caught up. But and on the 30 side, you're doing the same thing. And if a student is only, if students taking part-time hours and just doing the summer, picking up a couple courses each summer, you're going to have a lot more students who are then eligible for reverse transfer once they hit, say, 15 hours. Because at minimum, the student has to complete 15 hours for a 60-hour associate's degree at one community college. So, I think at 30 hours, I think we've got a relatively straightforward process. So,
the other thing is if we were to initiate those much earlier, then the proportion of students who would be ineligible upon receiving the letter would increase. And I think it would really, the students would be at a disadvantage to get a letter once saying, maybe you've got this degree, they go apply, it doesn't happen, then they're kicked back into the system. The next time they get the letter, it's not going to be so eagerly received. So I think that's also a consideration in that process. We want to get them where they really, if they say yeah, and if we send it on, they're actually going to get it.
I hesitate to mention, but in response to Dennis's concern, my institution has been really worried about retention. I think our problem has other origins, and a little bit of data, but this one, reverse transfer, came up. This was one of the things, the concern you expressed came up at my institution. So they've been looking at it, and we have a little data, but it's very low numbers, and so it's just almost anecdotal at this point. But we don't see any. We've had a couple of reverse transfer students not retained, but we haven't seen any real pattern. And those that have not been retained, and I think there were like, if I remember right, 4 or 5. Were students that were high-risk students anyway. And so we haven't seen either in the little bit of data, we haven't seen that reverse transfer somehow helps retention or harms it. But again, it's at this point, there isn't very much data, but so far it hasn't emerged. I've been asked to ask everybody to pass your envelopes with the cash over so that they can be picked up and we can get started with ordering lunch, because that is, after all, an important matter. If you'd pass them this way so they can be picked up for you down to this end and over to this end. And this, yeah, exactly. Is there any more input on this issue, or are we essentially ready to say, well, it's fine the way it is, and with what we've learned and clarified today, not to recommend any changes in the number of hours, those sorts of things. Yes.
After hearing all the discussion and stuff, I like the way it is right now. I'm okay with moving forward that way.
Okay. Any objections to that? Okay. McGregor, you want to take us to the next topic?
You bet. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate your input, and it does help us as we're preparing responses to legislation and that type of thing, so thank you. The next item is the discussion of the development of recommended area or discipline tracks for the new curriculum. And this is something that we discussed briefly about a year and a half ago, and I wanted to bring it up again to see if there were further steps that we could take to look at specifics. What we're trying to look at is there an advantage to having a specific core curriculum down to the course level so that students in particular discipline areas would know exactly what courses to take for purposes of transferring to university. So if you're talking about a student in general business or in humanities or in, we're doing engineering specific, so it's a broader transfer compact kind of idea, all solely focused on the core curriculum, so that students that are going into the sciences know that we want to look at, we want to have calculus, we want to take our basic biology and chemistry, or depending upon the degree, what courses they need to take regardless of the institution they're starting at. And so that it doesn't devolve down to the advisors every time to know what courses they ought to take depending upon which degree program, but rather is there something broad and general enough that we can say, here are 42 hours that will work for you. It's not mandated, and we're not saying you can't take other alternatives. We're just saying if you want the basic presentation and the basic opportunity, here are the 42 hours that you can take to prepare you for this degree program. And so just that's kind of what our thought was to try and help students know what core curriculum courses to take depending upon specific areas that they were interested in pursuing for a degree. And just wanted to get your feedback and any guidance or recommendations that you might have in that regard.
If you would indulge me a second, we did last year when we were developing the core curriculum, we did a study of all the states. One of the things that we looked at was to see if anybody had tracks. It was briefly mentioned. One example is Arizona. They do not have a common core for the state, but they do have tracks. They have 3 tracks, one for business, another for arts, and another for, liberal arts, and another for sciences. And they have a pretty darn good website. If I can get it open, that life would be perfect. Just so you could see what they are doing in Arizona, or not. And it'll freeze up on me. What they're really doing is they have different semester credit hours in the components. They have, I believe, 5 different areas. Thank you, Jose. Where students, they still have the same component areas as we do, but they have different hour emphasis. Sciences, students in the sciences take more hours in the sciences. Students in the liberal arts take more social and behavioral sciences and that sort of thing. So, again, they don't have a common core curriculum. It's not down to the course level. It's just general 8 hours in science as opposed to 6 or even 3. And each community college has one list of courses. But let me rephrase that. All the community colleges have one list of courses. Jose, if you'd scroll down just a hair and click on any one of those 3 tracks so you can see the requirements that are occurring in Arizona. So they have slightly different hours for different component areas, and that's how Arizona is doing it for them.
One of the changes to the core curriculum was to do away with the institutionally designated option, which required an institution to make a choice on behalf of all students that everybody needs to do a diversity course or everybody needs to do a speech course. one of the changes that we made when looking at replacing that with the component area option is that as long as courses in that component area option relate directly back to one of the foundational component areas, there is the possibility in the CAO of making some accommodations similar to this so that students in the STEM areas could count more of their science and math. Students in business who want to use one economics course for their social and behavioral science could count another economics course as part of their CAO. So the UEAC did look at this, and part of, I think, what we're finding is really useful about the way the CAO is being implemented is that it does allow each institution, because we know each institution does not offer exactly the same list of courses. Even the community colleges pick and choose from among the courses in the ACGM. But at least there's this opportunity to do some tailoring and recommend courses for different disciplines or general directions.
I would like to say something about that. A&M at about 50,000 is a loose association of about 10 villages. And the core curriculum that works well for one of those villages doesn't always work well for another. So I'd like to cautiously endorse this. My guess is there are a lot of problems associated with it that I'm not thinking about right now, but it would seem to me that a track that might incorporate some courses that are primarily appropriate to biomedical science, College of Science, might be something we'd want to explore, possibly technology, engineering, possibly social and behavioral sciences. I'm not quite sure about that, but what I would see as a possibility is that it would assist those students transferring into especially large and specialized universities, prevent them from having to take additional courses. Even if they transfer in core complete, they had the wrong math for that particular major, and so they're faced with another 6 hours of mathematics perhaps beyond what they might take. So I think it would be worthwhile to sit down and explore these ideas further and see what the possibilities are.
And if I may, Dr. David Gardner, the Deputy Commissioner, wanted to jump in here. This was something he was interested in pursuing, so I wanted to let him have the opportunity if possible. Do you have a microphone you can use, David?
Yeah. Thanks. One thing we observed while developing the first transfer compacts as he went from mechanical engineering to chemical engineering to chemistry to some of these other things is we found that some of the same courses were emerging that without trying to develop an engineering core, we were doing it in a de facto way, and by the end we actually had identified what you needed to take for if you were entering a College of Engineering. I think in some areas, you mentioned the social sciences, there seems to be more flexibility in terms of what you would take in the core. But in some areas where because of the accrediting bodies, it's for one area they're more rigid in terms of what you want to take. Business being one of the areas, ABET being another. That this made a lot of sense. And I've talked to a few community college presidents over the years, and they thought that it would actually help them do some planning in terms of what courses they offered. It also helps potentially in terms of if you transfer to any university, just what you were saying. We found that there were some students who received an associate degree in something sort of called engineering at a few community colleges that did not include calculus, for example. They were all, when we talked to individual students, they were surprised to learn that they needed to take more math when they transferred to the university. So we're trying to sort of address that. I don't know if it'll work. I think what you describe at A&M, you find at UT Austin. I think that the core is somewhat different. I think at University of Houston, probably Tech, a number of universities, that's the case. But the idea is to target it sort of in broad areas where it makes sense, in some areas it may not. So that's the real reason to do it, and I think we have to look at it going forward to see if it really works. But early returns on what we've done in the transfer compact, it's really helping advisors. And in fact, with that, if you've seen it, advisors actually get a layout of exact what they can hand students. This is exactly what you need to take, and if, in fact, you take these courses, it will transfer. And so anyway, I hope you'll sort of weigh in as we go forward. It's going to help a lot of students, and I do want to say I don't think there's going to be a lot of issue in terms of community college students wanting to who transfer going back to the community college. And I think just one note on that. In the letters that are sent out, I think you probably ought to explain to them that you don't have to go back to finish this up. The whole point is you've moved on and you don't have to go back to the community college unless you want to.
Thank you very much. If I may just add a couple other items. This is not intended to be prescriptive and is not intended to preclude other courses being offered in the core curriculum in any way. What we're considering is trying to find ways to improve the information that students receive at community colleges and at four-year institutions so that they know if I'm interested in going into the sciences, that A, I'm going to want to take calculus, and B, I'm going to want to take the labs with all of the courses in the sciences and not take, not choose the lab option to get out of it. And I think there are some situations like David described with engineering and calculus where students unfortunately take the bit in their teeth and just go on because they may not have listened to their advisor, they may not have had the opportunity to get in with an advisor, the advisor may not have been able to provide them with a clear indication of which course to take because of they don't know which school they're going to go to. And so what our thinking was that if we could develop some very general, but also taking the highest standard, so that if it's going to require calculus, that we put calculus in as the core curriculum math requirement for that area. And if it's going to require the labs, we include that on the one-pager so that when a student walks into an advisor, whether it's on a community college or at the university, they can be handed one sheet that says, here are the courses you need to take if you're in the social sciences, or here's another sheet if you're going into the engineering, or here's another sheet if you're going into the liberal arts. And to be able to do that in such a way that if you're a four-year institution dealing with your native students, obviously you can adjust that form and adjust that sheet however you choose to based upon what your knowledge is of your own institution and the options and what's going to be relevant for your degree programs. And you can do the same thing at a community college where you can adjust that to reflect maybe your transfer partners if there are specifics. But if you don't change anything, it's still going to be a benefit to the student. And it's still going to give them that clear message of, and especially when we're talking about returning students, older students, non-traditional students who are coming back to school, they want a clear path. And if we give them the smorgasbord of, God forbid, 300 core curriculum courses, 200 core curriculum courses, 100 core curriculum courses, and go, you get to pick, congratulations. They don't want that. They want to know as best as they can exactly what they have to take to be successful, to get in, get their degree in the minimum number of hours, and get out. And I think that this could provide them that mechanism.
What I want to caution against is the midpoint in this. I think it's very appropriate for a biology student to be told this is the way to go. But if you say to all STEM students, this is the way you need to go, then you would have the potential of someone who's headed into medicine taking geology.
Absolutely.
And that is so it's hard to classify it in the broad category like STEM and liberal arts and arts, because those choices within that piece of the core, that foundation area of the core, become really important for that student. And so we need to parse it at the degree level not at the general broad track level, because I fear that that's where the students may actually end up with some challenges.
I need to sit to do this. We've actually talked about that very issue, and so I think when people hear this, they imagine it's extremely rigid. But one of the points that would be made, say, if you had a science layout, would be if you're planning on going into geology, where you have the option you need to take geology. If it's biology, it's this. But where it's important is if you're going into one of these, you need to take this calculus. Or there's some things that are in common that they all need to know, but it wouldn't be so rigid that it would say, I don't know, what you're saying is so obvious to me, and we've discussed it, and I think but we're not communicating it very well, obviously, because when you talk about sciences, there are just some things that you have to take regardless. But there are other things that are going to depend on your field, and you need to make it clear in that designation. And it seems to me, it would never occur to me that somebody that wanted to major in geology would take biology instead. But you need to lay that out correctly. So it would be. I know this happens. I mean, I was at a university.
Well, and I think
we can share a lot of terrible stories about that.
And I think your point is well taken, Celia. And I think there are, this is conceptual at this point. So I think there's the opportunity for us to develop, the science rubric, so that, really what we're talking about is 1301, 1302, giving them the specific options or the general options and giving them specifics for those, and then maybe looking at the degree specifics and just breaking it out as part on the same page.
So, and just because I'm rolling off and I want one more chance to say this, if the students actually had the capacity to go in wherever they were in their degree area and say, this is now my track, because they're going to change their minds, and say, I can do it this way at this school or this way at this school. If we could get that live cross-platform transfer thing, that would make a huge difference, because one of the challenges we face is that students often do change their direction. In fact, I think the numbers nationwide are about 80% of students in 4 years change their major. And so to think that we're going to be able to catch them and give them a clear path at the beginning is probably a fallacy. To think that we want to give them a clear path from wherever they are right now, their most efficient way to where they now have decided they want to be, is going to be dependent upon that kind of interactivity. And I know it's a big reach right now, but if we could move towards that, that would be a huge benefit.
The degree audit system is something that obviously we at the coordinating board are very interested in pursuing. The challenge is the diversity of SIM systems. When we're dealing with, I'll be generous and say more than 20 different systems and different iterations, it becomes a challenge for us. And the costliness of it is so much higher because of that it's a little prohibitive, especially in some of the tight times we've had. But going forward, that was part of in the adult degree completion project that we're looking at with Red Lantern. What is it? Red Lantern. I don't know. It sounded kind of superhero to me when I said it.
That's a green
with Red Lantern, we are looking at kind of the inception of degree audit and how these systems work and how we might be able to expand from it. And believe me, I mean, I raise that every chance I get to, so I appreciate it, Sue.
And I want to clarify, don't think for a second that if we're going to go down this route without including people in it. One thing we've learned from the voluntary transfer compacts is when the faculty and administrators have sat down to do this, I mean, they do an incredible job, and we're essentially pulling it together. We're not doing it. It's the faculty that are making those decisions. And if it doesn't work, we just won't do it. Another issue is this is really for the purpose of advisors as much as anything. Actually, the current president at Temple, Glenda Barron, sort of made me start thinking about this a few years ago when she talked about articulation agreements. And you have some folks, those of you that are at community colleges know, your advisor might have in their file 50, 60 articulation agreements. No reasonable advisor can really know all of those well, and when they differ between the 10 10 universities in terms of what they need to do. It's very daunting for any advisor to recently do that. So we're, in some ways, trying to help the advisor almost more than the student in a way. And so if a student comes in, actually, a student at UT Austin, for example, I know of who's double majoring in accounting and economics, and there's special problems at UT Austin because of the different cores between the liberal arts school and the business school. And they really needed a lot of help in terms of selecting the right courses in their core that would work for both of those areas. And so we're just trying to sort that out. There's a prominent professor at Swarthmore, of all places, one of the ultimate liberal arts colleges, that says students actually have too many choices. And we're just trying to help clarify that for them. But without becoming a rigid process, it may be worthless, but we have a lot of students who are taking 30 or 40 hours more for a degree that don't need to, not because they're exploring, but just because they got lost. And we're trying to help that, and it will never be perfect. You're absolutely right. I won't say anything more.
Why stop at the 42 hours? Why not have 60 hours? And, there were, 10 field of study curricula developed? I mean, whatever happened with that?
We're actually, and that's something else that we're moving toward, is we've got the transfer compacts that we've developed. The transfer compact for engineering will take the place of the field of study for engineering, and we are going to be developing over the next couple of weeks the plan for how we're going to move forward with the transfer compacts. We feel very strongly that those are, as you're absolutely right, the 60-hour transfer compacts are incredibly valuable when we can get all of the institutions signed on to them, both community and technical colleges as well as universities. And so we want to continue to expand and move forward. We've had a list of degrees that we've been working on for the past couple of years and that we will finish out. I believe that the direction that we will move is to look at transfer compacts for those field of study areas as kind of the next iteration of the voluntary transfer compacts, so that we can, A, update and revise the field of study curricula and morph it into the transfer compacts. And that's kind of what my goal is over the next 2 years or so, is to look at developing transfer compacts to replace the field of study.
Something that I think that as this conversation moves forward, people need to continue to keep in mind is assessment, because a lot of community colleges have a general education Associate of Arts degree, and that is the degree that their assessment addresses. So if you start dividing it up into tracks, there is the potential for requiring significantly more extensive assessment systems in community colleges. And I'm not suggesting that that's wrong or that would necessarily happen, just that as the UEAC works to make decisions to improve things for students, we also need to keep in mind that the assessment pieces are always going to be there, and we have to know what those decisions that we make will impact across the board, not just on the front end with the advisors, but on the assessment process as well.
And Danny, maybe I'm not following as well as I should. When you're saying that the assessment of the core curriculum and of your general associate degree, the general associate degree allows for great latitude in terms of the courses that may be taken in the core curriculum to fulfill the requirements for the degree, correct?
Yeah, and like I said,
I don't think this would, our intention would certainly not be to change that in such a way that it would impact your degree programs.
It might not at all. On the other hand, depending on who your visiting team is, they might look at a track as something that needed a specific assessment process. And I'm not saying that this is an argument in opposition to considering this process. I'm just saying because our assessment folks aren't here, we shouldn't leave off considering how things might impact assessment.
And maybe terminology may play as much of a role in that as anything, so that we don't call it a track, which has a very different connotation when you're talking about a degree track. as opposed to what we're trying to do, which is to develop a common advising instrument or something along, what is that acronym, CAI? Anyway, I don't think we have a CAI, do we? Anybody know a CAI acronym? Anyway, but I think that's a very good point in terms of our terminology, and that may point us in a bit of a different direction. Larry?
Is the thought to have specific courses identified or types of courses? And when I say specific, I'm talking about courses from the general...
The ACGN.
Yeah. Is that the idea?
The idea is to have as much specificity as possible to avoid that smorgasbord approach. But again, we're at the conceptual stage, so we're trying to figure out ways to make this easier on students and advisors. And so, I mean, if we're heading down a rabbit trail, we need to know that. But at the same time, we want to be able to provide those students and those advisors with as clear a path as possible, much like the transfer compacts for the core curriculum. And so from that perspective, I think, if we could, ideally in my mind, if we could get down to saying English 1301 and English 1302, calculus, going through and giving them a list of as many of those 42 hours as we possibly can to provide them with a common foundation. I'd like to see it be as specific as possible.
And those would be developed by curriculum area experts?
Yes, sir. Mark?
Kind of have two questions. One, as there's a push for the 60-hour degree, these transfer compacts that I've seen come out so far are above 60. Are we going back to revise those? And two, as we shape them in the future, are we going to be targeting 60?
Believe me, I had some major conversations with Jim Nelson and other members of the engineering transfer compact groups about the 62 to 65-hour transfer credits. And because of the way that they're set up and because of the number of hours required for the engineering degrees, we felt like there was justification to allow for a higher level. And so the 60-hour cap would be hopefully set up in the same way that the 120-hour rule is, which allows for academic interest in terms of licensing, accreditation, or certification requirements. And so that based upon that, we would allow the higher level. So our intention is not to go back and revise the engineering transfer compact.
But let me clarify. What the voluntary transfer compacts do is say, if in fact the student takes these courses at a community college, and in the case of engineering schools that have signed on, what they're saying is we will accept these in transfer. It's not saying that they have to take X hours at a community college, but it's saying we're not going to question these courses. They're going to be accepted. So one of the things discussed was, in fact, there are courses in many of those compacts that there are community colleges that don't offer at all. They're just not available. That doesn't mean the student can't transfer and take the hours. So if they take, say, if the compact identifies 66 hours, if they take 33 at a community college, they can transfer. If they will get credit for all those. If they get all 66, they will transfer.
And we're kind of mixing.
But it's not, so that there's a difference in terms of what's required for a degree.
Yeah, it's the difference between the transfer compact, which is not a degree, and the new engineering associate degree, which was developed as a result of the transfer compact. So the engineering degree, associate degree, we have approved based upon accreditation requirements. And the transfer compact is the same number of hours, I believe, as what the associate degree is requiring. So there's not going to be any need to change those.
The second question, this is kind of more for, I guess, for the four-year institutions, as we're trying to figure out our core and what we're going to do. Got a lot of nervous folks at campus because they're looking at it and seeing where courses fit and where courses don't fit. One of the nervous groups is physical education. And my question is, are the four-year institutions going to continue having that in their degree plans where it would transfer up? And if they're not, then that kind of answers how we have to shape some of our stuff in our core.
I'll say this, and I've tried to be as clear as I'm statutorily allowed to be. The coordinating board may not designate which courses may or may not be taught. When we were going through and working with the core curriculum advisory group, the question came up about physical education and whether or not it should be included in the core. And there are some of you that were on those committees, so speak up as I misstate something. But the impetus in those committees, in that committee, seemed to be not to include physical education in the core curriculum. As a result, when you look at the definitions in the foundational component areas, there was never an inclusion of anything related to an activity course. And so there is nothing defined in the foundational component areas which seems to apply to an activity course or which would meet, for which an activity course would meet those standards for one of those foundational component areas. However, our job is not to say whether or not you can have a physical education activity course in your core curriculum. It's merely to say whether or not the process that you've established and by which you've assessed how those courses meet the foundational component areas is appropriate. With regard to the universities, I know that the universities have raised many questions over the years about why the community colleges continue to have physical education in their programs when none of the universities require physical education in their degrees or in their core curriculums. And so, I'll leave it up to the universities to kind of respond to that as well.
In looking at this further, wouldn't it make sense to see what the universities come up with in implementing the foundational core component areas so that you would be able to match whatever you recommend, or the way I see it, prescribe for certain tracks so that there's not a complete mismatch? I'm thinking, for example, of the communication foundation area. We don't know yet because it hasn't yet been proposed to our university core curriculum committee, but communication courses, 1301 and 1302, might end up being the primary courses that satisfy the communication component area. And if for a track you end up stipulating that English, 1301 and 1302, be the recommended courses, and they're hardly offered, if it turns out this is a hypothetical because we haven't done it yet, then there could be a real mismatch there. So can this action be postponed until you see what the universities roll out in satisfying the new core curriculum component?
From my perspective, I think we would have to wait until the institutions have established their new core curriculums so that we could then take the next step of saying, okay, we know which courses the institutions are proposing and have available, and then taking that next step of, okay, if we're going to try and develop these for specific disciplinary areas, what courses out of the list should we be identifying for students in those areas to take? Now, does that seem reasonable that we would, I don't believe we can do it at this point because we don't know what courses are available. We probably have a general idea of most of the basic courses that are probably going to be proposed by the institutions because presumably you're not all out there madly creating new courses to meet the new core curriculum. We're just kind of working to revise around the edges at times. So some of you may be. Danny's looking at me like I'm crazy, but which isn't unusual. But in any case, does everybody kind of agree that we probably need to wait until after the courses are approved and before we try and move to this direction?
I think Dennis raises an important point because we have a new core and we're telling universities and colleges to go out and develop their core. And we've given them latitude in that. And now what you're saying is we're going to take that latitude away. So they're going to do lots and lots of work, and then they're going to have a committee come behind and say, you did that work, but sorry, you have to change it this way.
And I don't want that to be the message that's going out.
Well,
if that's the message that's being heard, I don't want that to be the message, because what we're trying to do is not to limit the options, but rather to provide an explicit path for students. Not to say they can't deviate from that, or even that your institution has to use it.
Well, I can understand, let's say, for example, engineering. There are courses in engineering that need to be taken in the sciences, and I understand that. But my question is then, is this committee going to determine what course needs to be taken in the communication component of the core, in the social science component of the core as well? Are they just going to be focused on specifically the science component of the core? You know, I mean, if they're going to just have wide latitude to decide from top to bottom what needs to be taken, if you're going to go into engineering in the core, then yes, that is prescriptively telling the universities exactly what needs to be in those areas in the core, and it's going to cause a lot of unhappiness.
It's not prescriptive. That's what I'm trying to be clear that we're not intending this to be prescriptive. We're merely intending to provide this as an option that students and advisors could use to have very clear understanding of what courses will, without question, be accepted into those disciplinary areas. We're not saying you couldn't have communication instead of English 1301 to meet the communication foundational component area. Merely that, this is something that these courses are definitely going to be acceptable in that field.
But that in itself implies that they are the ones that you want, because those are the ones that are going to be acceptable.
The others may still be accepted.
It may not be prescriptive, but you may not be saying this has to be it, but you're going to, you get the feeling as a university, well, we've got to do that because this is the ones, that the coordinating board says the students need.
I'd like to kind of further add to that point on the grounds that if we do provide a list, advisors may look at that list and say, oh, these are the courses the students should be taking, must be taking. The students see this. Students are very good at finding lists and saying, oh, this is the quick and narrow list I need to work my way through, and they may just naturally omit all the other options. And that's going to affect the course offerings that are going to be available because all the students will be piling into these specific courses, and it might affect enrollment in offerings and other courses and disciplines, which ultimately might affect the diversity of courses we're providing for the students as a whole. So it might very much narrow the focus down on students. Even if it's not a prescriptive, it might be taken as an extremely encouraged option.
I think this will actually help the student because as a senior in high school, you come out and most of us are not completely sure what we want to do or major in. So maybe we have an idea, okay, I want to go into the health sciences field. I want to go into the business field. And from there, taking those basic courses will guide us even more. I know you're saying we might miss on some other classes that we could take, but it would be an option for the student whether or not to sign up for those courses. So in a way, the student has that choice of either keeping this track and maybe further on not having to retake the class because it wasn't transferred, but they also have the opportunity to choose a different course if they want to. And it's their responsibility, knowingly, that in the end they might have to retake another class.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
There seems to be a kind of a Boolean logic in how we would set up our core, in that in order to give students specific paths to their degree at their transfer institution, we have to provide more options for them in the component areas so that they'll have a wider field to choose from in narrowing their choices down. So it seems to me that we're at the community college level, we're being encouraged to spread it out a little bit so that students can pick up that extra science course or can get a lot of their math done for an engineering degree, something like that.
Jeanette?
Would it be accurate to say that that this kind of agreement would be most useful for students who don't know what institution they want to transfer to? This wouldn't get in the way of transfer articulation agreements with specific institutions.
We definitely wouldn't want them to be conflicted with articulation agreements. But most articulation agreements, when you're talking about the core curriculum, unless it's discipline specific, like requiring calculus for engineering or the labs for the sciences or those kind of things, they're not going to be discussing whether or not you should take English or communication or whatever those are. But so I think from my perspective, what I see as being the advantage here is, at some institutions there's a wide array of options that you can take for your social science credit, for your, for communication, for science, for all of these areas. And it can be a little intimidating, and it can be especially intimidating to students who are first generation and who don't have anyone in their family who they can go to, may not have gotten a really strong advising in high school, and coming into an institution and not being able to have a firm picture in their mind of where they need to go. And so I understand the challenges of faculty not being able to teach some of the courses that they've taught in the past if all of a sudden all of the attention goes down to a narrower band of courses. I don't see that there's going to be a true increase in the expectations in the breadth of course offerings at community colleges, because from my perspective, the focus for these would be very general, and I would expect that every community college in the state would be offering the courses that would be incorporated into this type of framework. But again, I'll be completely honest, I'm more interested in making sure that the students have a clean path than ensuring that there is a breadth of courses that a more limited number of students takes. Because, 17th century poetry is a fantastic course and maybe could meet one of the foundational component areas, but is it as valuable to a student in the core curriculum as the entry-level 13 English 1301? I don't know. I mean, those would have to be the discussions of the discipline areas.
And I'd just like to add on to that. I really don't see this having as much of an impact at community colleges because we have a much narrower focus when it comes to our core component areas. And as we move forward, we don't see even the new core curriculum impacting us that much, although we are doing needs assessment and collecting data to ensure that we'll have that necessary fit. But one of the things I'd like to underscore is it's great to have that particular course that you're talking about, but in a state and in a nation where we're losing 50% of our students from fall to fall, having coherent sequences that are narrowly defined for our students to ensure that they do not get lost and have support and have the strongest advising to support them, from my perspective, is a very good thing. Now, having said that, I'd be interested in knowing more exactly what this looks like. You've mentioned the AGEC, is that what you call it? AGEC. So what the Arizona model is, I'd love to be able to see, so what does it look like there? How would that look, in theory here, and what research exists, from other models outside of Texas, such as AGEC, to show us or demonstrate the value added in doing that. Conceptually, theoretically, it makes absolute sense to me, but what data do we have that would help guide us?
Can I make a suggestion then? I mean, I think from a conceptual standpoint, I think that we at least have a broad consensus that this is something to look into. I'm not saying everybody agrees that this is the direction, this is what we ought to do, but just in terms of gathering some more information. So as we are going to be dealing with this after the approval of the core curriculum in 2013, perhaps what we can do is go back and work with staff to try and answer some of those questions, Linda, and to try and look at doing some mock-ups based upon the current core curriculum and looking at what Arizona and others may have done in terms of the layouts. And I think from a broader standpoint, this doesn't have to be something that every institution pushes in terms of having all of your advisors with this sheet of paper that says, here's what you can do if you want to go into the sciences for your core curriculum. I don't think it would be bad if everybody did that, but I don't think it's something that has to be done that way. And I think that this can be a very broad, general opportunity for students to get a different perspective and perhaps have something there, but it's not something that is prescriptive or intended to be prescriptive as we move forward. And so, I mean, from my perspective, I think we can kind of take a step and maybe looking toward a spring UEAC meeting, discussing this further internally and getting any feedback that you all have to do some mock-ups.
I just wanted to say that I think that this would probably be really, really beneficial to students, and I think most community colleges would be really happy to have that option for their students. I think the issue will be whether or not the four-year institutions volunteer to participate in it, because if your feeder, the schools your students are transferring to, you've got 15 different ones, and all 15 of them have something different, and they don't any of them agree to participate in this voluntary activity, it's not really going to matter whether the community college does it or not. So I just wanted to make the point that its value will depend on the four-year institutions choosing to participate.
Well, I think there's lots of everything. The devil's in the details, I guess. But the idea that appealed to me was, and I forget the acronym, but the advising instrument. Common advising instrument that we and I guess I want to get the sense of the group. I think it's a good idea for the staff to look into some of the issues that have been raised today, and just if we want to, I mean, we have some time to look at this. We've agreed that we need to. That was my initial response to that, knowing on my campus the busyness with getting ready for the 2014 core and the approvals, this is not the time to add anything to that. I mean, if I went back and said that, there would be somebody saying, get a rope. And
they might not even say it.
They're very courteous before they take you out. But in terms of the UEAC and moving forward, is there does this group think that we might want to form at this time, or perhaps after the spring meeting, a subcommittee that is made up of members of the staff and members of the UEAC and some professional faculty, perhaps, that can inform us? It would give us an opportunity to take this issue back to our campuses and get educated about what others might see as some of the worms in the can that we would need to deal with. And so is there any interest in doing that at this time or shortly? Catherine, in terms of forming a subcommittee, I don't know the procedure. Would they simply volunteer to you to be involved in that?
I think maybe this is something we could think about and perhaps during lunch discuss a little bit. Also, I thought Danny brought up a really important point about assessment, the kind of thing that McGregor suggested and I love the idea of this common advising instrument. I think that's brilliant. And because I've worked with advisors to develop the method for assessing advising, I think there are advisors, there are people in the advising community who would also be really interested in serving in the same way that Lorraine Phillips and Danita McAnally served the UEAC as consultants during the core curriculum redevelopment, where we wanted to make sure that we did not overlook or just do something stupid that would not be accessible. And I think maybe two groups I would want to consult with would be assessment professionals and advising professionals, to ask them to come in and work with some of you if you want to do it that way. And I think, staff would be happy to see what we can uncover about what other states are doing similar things, and how, again, when Lucy and I discussed this yesterday, she said, the states that are doing these kinds of things, they don't necessarily have the same legal framework for their general education requirements that Texas does. That if one institution decides to do this, that's one thing, but to make it work in a whole state that is complex as ours, we'd have to put some thought into it. So, what better group than this?
Can I just add one thing? Do we have data from other states who have instituted this, what are we calling it, common advising instrument, as to whether more students were retained because they had a directed path versus those who were retained because they had more options, more flexibility to get there, to complete the degree? That'd be very helpful before we spent any more time on it. If it's convincing that these suggested degree tracks result in a much higher retention, degree completion, then that's very compelling. But if the jury's still out, it makes me a little nervous to rush into something like this that has potential far-reaching consequences.
And I understand that, and from my perspective anyway, I don't think we're going to rush into anything when it's going to have to wait until after the core curriculum. So we've got at least a year before we're going to be even trying to figure it out. So I think from that perspective, I think there is sufficient time to allow for some discussion and to allow to trying to answer some of those questions. With regard to the research, I'm all about trying to follow best practices and to follow research-oriented prospects if they're available, and if they're not, sometimes you got to be lay the foundation and do the analysis as you go. And so, I take your point.
But perhaps, I assume the staff can look into, those sorts of dimensions of outcomes that are important to us in terms of retention, time to degree, and those kinds of things, and the impact of something like this in areas where it's been tried.
And I think one of the challenges with trying to assess the impact of these type of instruments is that you're not going to be able to control for enough variables to determine the true impact on this particular, a particular instrument, because the way we're looking at using them, you're not going to have every advisor handing these out to every student. It may be every third or fourth one, and so trying to define a control group versus, an application group would be very difficult, just in terms of conceptualizing methodology for how you would analyze it. So we'll certainly try and figure out what Arizona's done to try and evaluate what they're doing, because they may have some interesting information.
As I get older, my favorite scene in a movie is from Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye's out there and he's doling out the milk to the folks and talking to the villagers, and somebody makes a statement and he says, "You're right," and somebody over here makes a statement that's in contradiction to that one, and he says, "You're right," and the third guy says, "Those don't match," and he says, "You're right." and I find myself often, when I'm in these kinds of complex situations, recognizing that there are rights that aren't always in conjunction with each other. And so the one thing I would want to be careful about in this, at least in this conversation, is that in making a general education, we don't make it a generic education that loses the fire of specificity that often happens when a student engages in a class around something that intrigues them. And so although we might have in a list of core classes some with really funky titles, because those are what will engage the student in the intellectual process that will, often those courses take them to the same sort of conclusion, but it is the hooks in their head from their own experience and passion that keep them moving forward. And so we want to balance the idea that we want to promote transferability with the capacity to have enough unique interest-bearing and experience-bearing hooks within the curriculum so that a student engages with it. And it's just one of those sorts of things where they're both right.
Okay. Well, I'll commit to staff, and we'll work on trying to at least put together some mock-ups. And if there's a number of members that want to work on a subcommittee, we can certainly provide them with information and go from there. And
let me just ask for, just to make me happy, a motion from the group. Is there a motion to create this subcommittee in a second? Okay. Second? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Yes?
If I may add a quick comment, and I know we're talking specifically as to a track for a field of study. A lot of conversations brought up within students, it's the fact that we are spending a lot of time on our basic core, taking our history, English, math, and all of those courses, and don't really engage much with the major that we want. So one of the ideas is probably either shorten up those courses, not necessarily because they're not important, but because a lot of students have been going through those courses 4 years of high school, and then they still have to take 2 more semesters of English, 2 more semesters of science, math, and all of that, when they don't really relate to their major. So I just wanted the board to take that in mind as well when considering a core for the students. I know this is like a drastic change of changing those courses, but a lot of students would also like to start earlier in their field of study. In my case, it's accounting, and I've already in my 3rd year, and it's not until right now that I'm barely really taking courses towards my major. So it's definitely one of the things that as a student I would like to see maybe accommodate more in my major, and also including more courses that will help me out prepare for my future employment. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it time to break? Is lunch here?
We don't have lunch yet.
I'm finding out if lunch is here. Yeah. I'm doing the messaging here.
if I could, while we're waiting, I actually I have a meeting at 12 that I have to be in for about 20, 30 minutes. And so would it be possible for me to go ahead and kind of lay out the temporary exemption discussion?
Absolutely.
And then if we break for lunch, that'll hopefully give me time to run upstairs and deal with this and come back?
Do that.
Okay. As you all know, the low producing program issue kind of was resurrected about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago now, when we established new criteria for low producing programs. What we initially set up, what was originally in place was 1 graduate per year at the doctoral level, 2 at the master's level, and 3 at the baccalaureate and associate degree levels. In working through the revised rules and the process by which we would evaluate low producing programs, we raised the standard from 1, 2, 3 to 2, 3, and 5. That process has been in place now. This is the 2nd year that we have gone through that process. We feel like from a process perspective, we've got a pretty good handle on it. In terms of the board, there was a desire on the board to increase the standards from 235 to a higher threshold. We proposed the higher threshold in April and then pulled it down from the board's consideration so that UEAC and GEAC would have an opportunity to review and provide input on those. As you may recall, those of you that were on the committees, the recommendation was made to extend the start point from which the programs would be considered under the higher standards of 3, 5, and 8 to push it out till 2018. We had initially started at 2015, and on advice of one of the GEAC members, realized that was probably too short, pushed it to 2017, and then again to 2018, because we realized that was really when the students would start being impacted starting now. And so to give the institutions the longest period of time with those cohorts, we chose to push it to 2018. In the discussions, the issue, there were a number of issues that came up that felt were needed to be addressed. One was geographic availability and how proximate to a degree program you should be. The second was the critical fields, high demand programs in terms of workforce need, in terms of industry needs, those type of things. And although that says critical and essential fields, I'm not sure of the difference. But in any case, it was really those two criteria. In looking at where we are now with the 2, 3, and 5 standards, we really did feel like that was the minimum, that if a program was not meeting those standards, the only reason why we would grant temporary exemptions were because they were on an upswing in their enrollments, upswing in their graduation rates, and it really looked like they were going to be able to meet the standard within the 2-year window. Or, conversely, that there were no small class sizes because it was a jointly offered program of one type or another, and so there was not an additional increased cost for maintaining that degree program, whether it was interdisciplinary in nature or something along those lines, but that they would be able to continue on. And so in these discussions with UEAC and with GEAC, the recommendation was made that if we're moving to this higher standard, this provides us with an opportunity to look at additional criteria for temporary exemptions for that higher standard. And so what we wanted to do was to come back in and talk with you all again about, okay, if we're going to move to the 3, 5, and 8 standard, what is close enough for a degree program? Is that different at the associate level than at the baccalaureate, than at the master's, than at the doctorate? And then also, what measure of critical field can we use to determine whether or not there should be a temporary exemption for those programs? And is there, we've provided 4-year temporary exemptions because we can't provide permanent exemptions due to statutory requirements says we must review every degree program within every 4 years. So temporary exemption is only temporary for 4 years, and then we review it and grant a new temporary exemption. And for the 4-year program, it's only for those degree programs that are like a master's that is the fallback for a PhD program for students who cannot complete the entire doctorate. What other reasons do we have for 4-year exemptions, Lucy?
That's the only one, the
the
master's that leads directly to a doctoral program.
So everything else goes on rolling or goes on a 2-year exemption. Based upon the board's actions a year ago when we did the appeals process, they said if you get a 2-year exemption this time, don't come back. And they actually said it in those words at the board meeting. So from our perspective internally, that's kind of the standard we're using for the 2-year exemptions that are going to be coming due next year. If you got a 2-year exemption, it's because we felt like the program had an opportunity to meet those standards next round. If you don't, we're not going to grant further exemptions absent major rationale behind it. It will then go to the board for appeal. And it will be up to the board to determine whether or not an additional exemption is required. If we raise the standard, our goal would be then to look at, for the higher standard, is there some set geographic availability that we should use? Does it, like I said, does it vary based upon degree level, by type of program, in other words, discipline, by the demand, those type of things? and we want your input on that. I will tell you from my perspective that I'd really like to see you help us understand at the doctoral level whether geographic availability should be a factor, because those are national programs, or at least they should be. Is that something that we need to look at differently? And I guess UEAC doesn't really need to address that one, but just as you all have broader perspectives and different things. So at the baccalaureate and undergraduate level, what's close enough? How do we define what's in high demand? And is that a hard and fast rule, or is there some kind of sliding scale in there that we need to be looking at? Now, is that as clear as mud enough to start a conversation, or at least to confuse everybody at the beginning? Okay. Thank you.
So I think lunch is here, and we have 40.
Come in a few minutes.
Okay. Are there any comments about this right now?
This is a real broad comment, and that is, as the funding in the state mechanism in the state moves toward outcome funding, if there continues to be a constraint on how processes are carried out, then you end up constraining the institutions both on process and outcome. You begin to constrict the capacity for innovation. If it's going to be outcome funded and the university has the capacity to support a low producing program because of grant funding, because of other things, then it seems like we want to give flexibility at one or the other ends of those spectrum, because higher ed is going to change. If we're in the kind of world we're in right now, we're going to have room for innovation. And if you constrain both the inputs and the outputs, or the process and the outputs, you begin to constrain the capacity of the institutions to be innovative in a world that is requiring innovation. And that's just a broad statement.
Can I throw out one thought to you? The outcomes-based funding is going to be, well, the proposal is for 10%, not 100%, not all of the base funding. If it were 100%, I'd agree with you that provides the level of identification that would be necessary to say whether a program was able to be continued. I guess from my perspective, innovation and is a critical part of higher education. It absolutely is an imperative. But if a program begins and starts and can't attract enough students because students choose not to come to that program, can't get jobs from that program, employers don't know what that degree is, whatever the reasons behind being unable to recruit enough students, or, and I hesitate to bring this up, but it seems very common, faculty don't want to recruit, then is it the obligation of the state to continue funding that program that's really not benefiting a significant number of students? And is that innovation truly valuable? Or is it just new for...
But the bottom line is faced by the institution in that matter, okay? And,
how's that?
And if the institution can't make ends meet, then it will have to get rid of those programs. There is some market force, even though this is a public institution, that comes to bear. One, and this is a total outlier, but there is a degree program at the University of North Texas that is completely funded by an industry.
Mm-hmm.
The faculty member, the amount of money, and that's a low-producing program at no cost to the state.
Mm-hmm.
There are other sorts of things that may occur with that. Now, that's not the innovation question per se, but we need to preserve in the process sufficient capacity for the institutions to be responsive to what's going on around them and to allow for innovation. And if we keep getting constrained on both ends of the spectrum, our capacity to be responsive, the room for responsiveness becomes more and more constrained.
Let me ask you this, because this is something I struggle with all the time in terms of new degree programs. Because believe me, you may not. I don't like telling every institution that comes in for a new engineering program no. But I've got a pretty good track record at it. I mean, and the challenge that I see is a lot of the constraints that institutions face are frequently self-imposed, because we do innovate in so many areas, and we get to the point where we've got multiple small programs that are these little niche programs that are pulling resources away from other larger programs that may need growth funds, may need funds to improve the quality of the program, may need funds to become competitive on a national basis as opposed to a regional or state basis. And yet we continually grow out, and I don't hear very much from institutions about improving up, improving the quality of that program, improving the competitiveness of an existing program, so that we become that, we have higher recognition of our existing programs rather than trying to increase our recognition for new programs.
And you may not hear those conversations because the coordinating board really performs a role that is more monitoring and not, we set a base limit, not a high limit in that. That's definitely the conversation that happens on campuses.
Well, but I ask, when institutions come and bring new degree programs, I ask what steps they're doing to take to increase the quality of existing degree programs, or what they would do with the resources they're plugging into a new program, that they could use those resources to go to increase the quality of an existing program. And I don't very often get an answer. And so I respect the fact that there's always that consideration at institutions, and especially at some of the institutions that are trying to raise their research and raise their focus in those regards. And I know they're out there. I'm just trying to share with you all kind of the challenges that I face with low producing and with new degree programs in terms of what that means for shared resources. Because a low producing degree program, it may only mean the difference between 1.5 FTEs or 1.5 faculty lines versus 1. But does that mean that there's nowhere in the institution where that half faculty line couldn't be taken advantage of more fully?
And that seems to me, though, to be a question for the institution.
Yeah, and I just don't know that those questions are being asked.
And I believe they are.
When I spoke with the Texas Council of Faculty Senates late last month, I ran some percentages, and 2.2% of the degree programs were considered low producing, and they produced 0.1% of all the graduates
in those disciplines.
And well, I was looking at total graduates for the year. And so one of the questions I asked the Faculty Senate members was to think about on their own campuses programs that they knew felt starved for resources, and to think about how much infrastructure resources it took for those programs that were contributing so few graduates. And I know that there are other ways to look at productivity on a campus, faculty research productivity, the research dollars they bring in. It can't be all about how many people are you giving diplomas to. But, I think the Faculty Senate members were very intrigued by this, and I could see them all kind of starting to think about some of the battles that they knew about on their own campuses. I just put that in for what it's worth.
And see, I can see the point. I know every faculty member wants to improve the quality of their programs and and tries to do that. I guess I'm just looking at it in terms of the finite resources issue.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm saying that much of that conversation is a conversation that does and should occur at the campus level.
And I would accept that, except I get the comments when I'm pulled off to the side from presidents and chief instruction officers and provosts saying, you know what, we just couldn't close that program because of a faculty member, or, you know, the tenure of the faculty, or those kind of issues, and we really appreciate you closing it for us. And that's not a rare occurrence?
No, there probably are occasions like that. It's Tevye. You're right. But the capacity for institutions to be flexible feels more constrained now than it has in the past.
Absolutely.
In a context of an environment where the capacity to change actually needs to increase, and that's the tension that I'm feeling.
But isn't that what we're doing with low producing programs? Is encouraging change?
Encouraging prescriptive change
been...
rather than innovative change that occurs within the campus itself.
But there is that room for that change. There is that time for that innovation that you talk about. We're not looking at these programs in the first 2 years. There's time for the institution to develop that program and tweak it and work with it over a 5-year period before the clock even starts. Effectively, you've got 10 years.
Well, and I'm really not talking specifically about. What I'm talking about is that as the prescription that comes, and we're experiencing this from the coordinating board, but we're also significantly experiencing this from other venues as well, from SACs and others. And as institutions have more and more dictated to them, they have less and less room to innovate and move forward in the context of an environment that is hugely changing and needing flexibility. And it's really a catch-22 for institutions. And so that I just wanted to put that forward.
Mac, one quick question before you go. Are those questions part of the application process?
For new degrees?
Yes. And if not, could we put them there? I mean, if we're looking at what impact does this new program that we want to propose have on existing programs or existing resources, and they answer it there.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it would be easier to do that way than you having to follow up later.
You're absolutely right, and that's a very good point, and I think that's great. Okay, I'll duck out of here. Thank you.
And lunch is here, and we have 45 minutes for lunch.
And we need to state that because the people who are broadcasting us statewide need to know when to come back. So we'll reconvene at 12:45.
Okay, well, I guess from my perspective, for UEAC, just looking at, is there a way to look at geographic availability for associate and baccalaureate degree programs? Is there some way to provide a minimum distance or a maximum distance or whatever in terms of the development of new degree programs and their availability? I mean, I know that there are challenges in that because with new degree programs, we face that in terms of, well, there may be a program 30 miles down the road, but if they're maxed out and they don't have capacity for more, then maybe a new program makes sense as opposed to expanding on an existing program. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But just to kind of have that conversation and get any thoughts that you all have in terms of geographic availability would be really helpful. And I'm being intentionally vague. So we're good with the rules as they are. We can just implement them, and everybody will be fine. And because I mean that the geographic availability is one that we get frequently in terms of throwing, institutions throwing that out as well. But it's 400 miles to the next closest program. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out a way if there's a way to quantify that to make it more consistent.
Are you using a quantification now?
No. We haven't used geographic availability as a determining factor in any of our temporary exemptions at this point. Is that a fair statement, Luz?
That's correct.
Okay.
Are you suggesting from this image that's on the screen that these regional geographic areas would be a boundary?
No, I'm absolutely not suggesting that. I think, and that's merely a pictographic representation of the state of Texas to try and jog neurons.
This is actually the way that the higher education regional
the regional
councils,
plan.
the regional plan has been put into effect. And so, when we look at, for example, balancing this committee regionally, one of the things we look at is where is your institution, which HERC region is it in? And we would like to have all of those regions represented as much as possible. Sometimes we don't get nominations from a particular region, but that can make a real difference for us.
The reason I included this in this particular slideshow was our planning and accountability area did develop this regional plan, and it does include the low-producing programs and what regions they're in. It also includes, as it states here, high and fast-growing occupations by region. Again, the question then becomes, if you've got two regions right next to it, two institutions right next to each other in two different regions, is that close enough? Is it by region? That was more to say, this is what we have data-wise, and how we have separated it as an agency. But as far as low producing goes, the door is wide open. Again, the question goes back to what is close enough, and for what level, as McGregor brought up earlier. The needs of a workforce student at a community college are completely different for those needs of even a baccalaureate student.
I'm assuming this discussion then is based on programs that are very similar in nature, not just the number of programs in an area.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the issues being raised, it hasn't been used. Geographic availability has been one of the criteria in the past, and it's being raised because of raising the low-producing program standard.
Yes, sir.
So it's we're thinking of adding this as one of the routine considerations.
And that was a recommendation that came out of UEAC and GEAC
exactly.
when we brought it back. And just I forgot to mention this earlier. I just want to make sure everybody knows that the consideration of the higher standard was tabled at the October meeting to the January meeting because our vice chair was not able to be at the meeting and he wanted to be there for the consideration. So we're still pending the increased standard and any action the board might take. So if the board votes this down, then this may not be relevant, but we wanted to at least have more feedback from you all to this rule.
I just have a quick question. So currently on the temporary exemption, there are 3 reasons. So this would be a 4th reason that you would then provide a justification for. So it's a discrete 4th reason. Is what we're thinking.
I think that's fair, yes.
I think yes.
Okay.
For temporary exemption, yes, thank you.
Right.
Yes,
right, for temporary exemptions.
Yes,
yeah.
or as I like to call it, a TE, because we've got acronyms for everything.
Everything.
Yes.
Okay. Now I know. Thanks.
Yes.
I know that in some areas, particularly when we start looking at the far western part of the state, we are dealing with lower population totals, but we are also dealing with much larger geographic distances in which students are potentially having to travel. Particularly when you start looking in the far west Texas area in particular, we're having students who are typically commuting sometimes 100, 120 miles each day to be able to attend classes. This is quite a strenuous commute in which they're attending what programs are available and offered to them at these institutions. If we have low-producing program issues where we have more programs closing in these regions, this might effectively prohibit or exclude certain communities, particularly in some of these rural areas, to be able to have the opportunity for education that they currently do have these options available now.
And just to throw yet another wrench in the works, how does online play into this?
Well, I think, McGregor, that's why this is such a puzzling question. You know, I look at our local situation. Each morning we have carloads of students leaving Bryan and College Station, driving over to Huntsville because they're students at Sam Houston. And so they drive two days a week or they drive 3 days a week. Likewise, we have a lot of students commuting into Texas A&M each day from the Houston suburbs. They're staying at home because of family, because of jobs, because of something else, and probably their round trip is in the neighborhood of 150 miles a day. Hopefully that's only 3 days a week instead of all 5. But in some areas, in some disciplines and some particular courses, those needs could be served reasonably well by online offerings, which are available at almost every institution that I can think of these days. There's certain key areas, enrollment in science labs, and field methods courses and that sort of thing, which demand face-to-face on-site. So when we ask the question about geographic accessibility, something offered at UT El Paso is equally accessible in College Station as it is if you're living next door to the campus, if it's a type of course that could be taken online. So, I really think we have to get deeper into this conversation. But the impact is what I'm really concerned about, because I think typically this is going to impact maybe rural first-generation students more than it will other kinds of populations. And it depends on how much we value service to those kinds of populations. Certainly, looking at those numbers which you had displayed a little bit earlier, we were supporting a lot of programs in the state that really were questionable, marginal. We had a few of those at Texas A&M, too, that we had to take off the books. But should we get rid of all low-producing programs if they're the last program left in physics in 2 regions of the state? And call that into question. That didn't help answer the question, but those are just some thoughts.
Another consideration, too, is it's very, very difficult to successfully teach welding online. And diesel mechanics really works better if the students can actually show up at the diesel mechanics lab. So a lot of the AAS degrees don't do very well online yet. Now, in future, there may be all kinds of really great virtual labs that make that a good option. But right now, there's not. And we're talking about whether we need a temporary exemption for geographic area right now. And I think probably that would be a good thing to have, or at least for these programs that don't work well online.
How much I'll show my ignorance, is there any didactic as opposed to clinical in welding or diesel mechanics where it's more instruction-based as opposed to practical?
Is there what?
Is there more is there more classroom instruction type for either of those programs? It's all practical oriented, right?
Almost all of it is.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm just trying to think, like, when we talk about whether or not chemistry can be online, well, chemistry can be online, the lab can, or is not. There are obviously some technology answers out there now that are starting to become better and better in terms of being able to do labs virtually. But if we're arguing about practical versus lecture, the chemistry class can be taught that way. The lab may be more, at this point, locally oriented. And so I was just trying to get a feel for 90%. If 90% of the program is practical, it doesn't make sense to try to do the 10% online necessarily. You might as well do the whole program face-to-face without trying to develop at a cost an online version. And so I just was trying to make sure.
Yes,
because
there are some programs that are 90% practical programs.
Yeah. And those are the programs where, the geographic availability, we're not answering that with online. And those are the things where we kind of need to lay those out perhaps and identify those programs that are practically oriented. I mean, I think most of those, the programs on the CTE side, a lot of those are going to be lined up that way. And so, I mean, I think we need to clarify that those programs maybe need to have one regional or geographical availability metric versus, a bachelor's in history. And I don't mean to pick on history. I'm a history major, so I mean I'm picking on myself. But I mean, that's a type of a program where online would seem to lend itself to a good availability for students, regardless of where they are or anything else, because we don't have too much practical there.
Another aspect with dealing with online aspects, particularly if we're looking at courses that have laboratories, a lot of the science courses, as far as the next step in which sciences will be progressing to, if we're looking at the health fields or the pre-med fields, most of those professional programs in schools don't actively recommend or encourage online courses, and they'll actually deny online labs for credit, is another thing that we've sometimes seen and encountered, particularly when discussing with the pre-health advisors from the various different professional schools. So it's something to take into account. If our students throughout the state are taking courses, they have to have these physical labs if they want to be eligible to apply to the medical schools, the dental schools, the veterinary school in the state.
Fair enough. I mean, maybe that's what we need to look at is, okay, having a double standard, having two standards in that regard for practice-oriented programs versus non-practice-oriented programs.
However you build it, you should probably, because I'm going to be gone, so it'll be you. However it is built, it should probably take into consideration access issues. So students who don't have who aren't ready for online aren't precluded from taking certain things. I mean, I think that needs to be a part of what's thought of when the criteria are prepared.
And I don't disagree with that. I think the challenge is that takes us clear back out to the, okay, so with that argument, every program should be at every institution.
I said it was going to be you, not me.
Yeah, the draft still works here at the coordinating board. We can call on special advisors. And,
I don't know how many of you are subscribed to I think it's the TCCIL or TCCIA list. Do you want to say a little bit about the discussion that's been going on the last couple of weeks about this very question, about what professional schools, medical schools especially, are willing to accept in terms of science courses? Because the question came up there, and one of the points that was raised was, how do those institutions know, beyond asking the student, whether their course was online or hybrid or what? Because that doesn't show up on a transcript. So one of the questions was, how do they know? But those of you who are, I'm lurking on that list like I do on others, but I thought you might want to bring some of that into this conversation.
Catherine, you're right. We don't transcript how the course was taught, so the only way they find out is if they actually ask the learner whether they took it online or not. So the transferability issue isn't always there. It's only there if somebody kind of fesses up that they did it that way.
So the message to online students: deny, deny, deny.
Just don't tell.
Don't ask, don't tell.
That's
okay.
right.
I think Rex Peebles committed to doing a little more research on this. He had contacted some people and said that he would bring some more information back to that list, so maybe you all should prod him a little bit. Tell him the UEAC invoked his name.
I have a question. Are there some disciplines that are going to be inherently adversely affected because they routinely have low majors but perform an important service function for the university? Maybe they're part of the core, for example. And I'm thinking of philosophy. That's never going to be, a wildly popular major, but if they don't meet the 8 threshold, will they cease to exist in a lot of places?
As a program?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, because I think the bottom line answer is you can be a service department or a service unit without the degree. So I think the simple answer is yes. If they're not meeting the standards, just because they have high numbers of students in their lower division core curriculum courses, doesn't mean that they should have a degree. And you know, does anybody disagree with that? I mean, I hear one of the other arguments that I hear consistently is, well, we can't get good faculty unless we have a bachelor's degree. And then I get the argument, well, we can't have good faculty unless we have a master's degree. And then I get the argument, well, we can't have good faculty unless we have the doctorate. And that's always one of those arguments where I question. So is what you're saying then, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, your faculty aren't good? Or you don't have a master's degree and your faculty aren't good? Because if you're saying if you don't have the degree, you can't recruit good faculty, what kind of faculty do you have now? So I guess I'm trying to figure out, based upon your question, what the right answer is, because certainly we don't want to inhibit institutions from getting high quality faculty, but I think a lot of the liberal arts institutions and a lot of smaller institutions would argue that they're able to get high quality faculty to teach in a service unit. Yeah, absolutely, and don't have bachelor's, master's, or doctorate.
Yeah, no, I
in
think,
some cases.
I think you're right. I mean,
we
have a philosophy program which, for a long time, is it's been a service program. They agitated for a long time to get a degree program. They finally got it, and now they're dealing with generating enough support, student support, to stay alive. But the faculty in that program is very good. It is more difficult, I think, to recruit, and I suspect that these programs could all point to, well, here's a faculty member we really wanted, and they turned us down for this reason. But that they would wind up with not very good faculty, it's just we didn't. I think our philosophy faculty is very good, and a very good teaching faculty. So.
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of quality. I think people who would be attracted to come and teach only service courses would have to be attracted to teaching only service courses and not, the broad spectrum of the field. So I do think it would affect the nature of the hire. And that's not to say anything disparaging about people who teach only service courses, but they are a different lot, I think.
I don't disagree with that at all. I'm just telling you how it's couched to me and how the argument is made to me when new degree programs are proposed. And it tied into how, whether philosophy as a service unit should be able to maintain their degree program even though it's low producing. And so that's why I brought it up in that regard. But from my perspective, if you're a service unit and you are actively recruiting students out of your service courses and have a good reputation and are able to attract enough students, you've got a degree program. But if not, and all your upper or significant portion of your upper division courses are small class sizes because you're not completing those majors, then that's a resource question for the institution.
Is distinctiveness of the program taken into account anywhere in that decision?
Actually, we did this time around for the first time. The Master of Arts in German at Texas Tech University, we did grant a 2-year temporary exemption for them because they are one of only 2 master's level German programs in the state. And so the uniqueness was an issue, and that was something that we did look at.
And that's sort of the last question that we had, because again, this is something that new that came up this year, was what about if it's the only one left, or if there's only 2 left? Again, regionality comes into it, the type of program comes into it. Level, exactly. Where are these lines drawn? We want to, our biggest concern when we are evaluating all of the temporary exemptions that come across is that we're consistent, that the decisions that we make for one institution are equitable and the same for another one. That's where we need your help, is help us draw those lines so when we as staff evaluate these temporary exemptions, it's like, okay, it's in this category of programs and we need to pay special attention to X on it. That's what we need in these discussions. This is year 2. And in year 2, our evaluation has become, I think, better and was far easier than the first year when we were coming with a blank slate. Your feedback and the words that this group gave and from the institutions who were affected by low producing changed the way that we evaluated temporary exemptions this year. With the potential change in thresholds, in 6 years, we will be changing, potentially, who knows what's going to happen in 6 years, how we evaluate again. So all the questions you're asking are exactly the questions we're asking. We want you to give us the answers, please.
And
I guess, to take the notes.
Yes,
I guess I want to
ready.
back up a little bit and just ask the staff, is because on the earlier question about, how far is too far and, what about, I think the answer that we gave was essentially it depends. I'm not sure that, and maybe the consensus out of that is if we're trying to get to a universal standard, you're not going to get there. That it's more complicated than that, and but I don't know whether you want us to readdress that to get a little more information or not. It seemed to me an unsatisfactory response that that there was. It depends. Figured out.
I think you all, kind of started to identify in terms of the practical programs versus perhaps more lecture-oriented or didactic-oriented programs. So, I mean, in that regard, I think
seeing what some variables are to move forward.
I think that provides us one criteria to start looking at. I think certainly the applied associate degrees would be looked at very differently than the baccalaureate degrees. And I think one of the other ways that we could look at this is, what's the base programmatic structure of a new institution? What are the critical fields that need to be taught in every institution in the state so that area has access to those degree programs? Is there really such a thing? I mean, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But, should poli-sci be taught in every institution? Business administration, interdisciplinary studies, English, history, biology. Well, now we're starting to get into higher cost. Chemistry, even more cost. Physics, even more cost. I mean, at what point is availability and access not as critical as consolidation of resources and economies of scale? And I mean, those are the questions that we ask all the time with new degree programs and that kind of thing. So,
I think one other thing you might want to take into account is the nature of the students that an institution serves. For example, at Stephen F. Austin, we serve a lot of first-generation students. The likelihood of those students going somewhere else, even at a, people might consider a reasonable distance, is going to be much smaller than students that come from families that have a long history of college. They probably are going to want to stay closer to home because that's their support systems. So for institutions that service students like that, there may be some smaller programs that serve a very important function for those students.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point that I wrestled with, and my staff wrestles with all the time. Is at what point does it cease being a local issue and become a statewide issue in terms of resource allocation, resource availability, and funding versus the local and individual benefit of having a degree program there when, they could go 100 miles away and get the program as well. So it's exactly the question, we're struggling with and that we're trying to get you all to help us with.
Well, I think this certainly is a statewide issue, which is complicated by population distribution. I mean, it really is a geographic problem. And I remember from the spring meeting, there was a lot of data introduced from other states about minimum levels for the programs. But I'm wondering if I do know that Australia took a look at this with a big national report. I think it was published in 2010 about how they serve the interior. The Canadian provinces and their national government have taken a look at how they deal with this in serving the Northlands. And our neighbors to the north, especially in Nebraska and the Dakotas, have taken a look at it. And I'm wondering if we can learn anything by trying to pry loose some of those reports. I know I have 2 of them in the office someplace, and seeing what kind of, if there were any significant criteria they suggested. I'll dig through the files. I'll be glad to send something over if I can find it.
You bet. And we'll look, too, and see if we can dig them up.
I know at Tarleton we kind of had a similar situation that Larry was talking about, that we're a regional, rural serving institution. And the state wants us to produce more STEM graduates, but those can be expensive programs to produce. We lost our physics program, which we're trying to put together a consortium. So we're looking at, and I'd be interested to hear any other kinds of creative means that institutions have come up with to keep providing those things to their students, to their service area. We don't have it off the ground yet, but it's in process. But I haven't heard anybody talk about, if we have a student in Stephenville who wants to study physics, we don't have a physics program. The nearest physics program may be at A&M, but they can't afford to go to A&M. A&M's very much more expensive than Tarleton. So I'm not sure how we encourage the talent and encourage students to go into those STEM fields if we economically prohibit the availability of them.
But how much is economically prohibitive if we have a physics program at every institution for 1 or 2 students?
Well, it's like the consortiums. If we're allowed to be creative and work with other institutions and provide those kinds of things, then we can still keep.
There was a consortium before that.
Yeah.
You can say but there was.
Yeah.
And 6 of the institutions that lost their physics programs were members of that consortium. I'm very hopeful that the new consortium will come out and be able to answer some of those challenges. And I think if we can, and if they can prove that they're successful, we've got a wonderful idea, a wonderful template for other similar type of laboratory-intensive programs might be able to take advantage of.
Right.
And so I absolutely am hopeful that they are able to come forward with something.
Have you seen any other models that other institutions or states or
not in
countries
Texas, for sure,
tried to put together to keep those programs available in those geographic
I think the online alternative has become the answer in most of those circumstances. Not necessarily, even moving into the sciences, that's become more of an answer. And I know that's one of the answers that Canada is moved toward. I don't know if Australia is the same way, but the availability of online STEM programs has been something that they've pushed for very much north of the border.
I'll just add from the private sector perspective that at Texas Lutheran we're partaking in a consortium for world languages for all the same reasons. And the success, it's new, but the success seems to be hinging on the use of technology. So it's the coming together of the two. But we've got 5 institutions spread across the state, and we're now able, students at Texas Lutheran, for example, can now take Mandarin, which I guarantee you they could not have taken without this consortium. But it's the very same issue. How do you keep these innovative programs when you've only got a student or 2 on campuses?
Well, and there were several foreign language programs that were identified as low producing last time and this time. And it's exactly those kind of consortia that we're going to have to step in and take the place for 2 reasons. The availability of the languages, and also to ensure that you can still have access to that in a lot of different locations rather than having to do, as we've been talking about, traveling 100 miles to get the same thing. And so I applaud that. I mean, there are other examples of joint degree programs around the state. A&M's dock at a distance in agriculture has been successful for a long period of time, although there are always hiccups along the way. The A&M and Corpus and Galveston have put together a doctorate in marine sciences with similar efforts to try and take advantage of some of the expertise across those institutions. Can they be successful? I believe they can. Do we have challenges that we have to overcome? Absolutely, and that's one of the key areas that the Physics Consortium has to come to terms with and is working on is, how do you deal with 3 different student information management systems across 6 institutions? How do you deal with multiple registration sections? How do you deal with the fact that the TCC&S is not applicable across all the same institutions? So not only do you have to crosswalk them, you're having to crosswalk them 6 different times for the 6 institutions you're trying to partner with. How do you address some of these issues, such as the curriculum development? So you're trying to develop a curriculum across 8 institutions, 25 faculty members, and those different curriculum committees and the different approval processes for each of those. So there are some significant challenges that have to be faced when you're trying to develop them. An online degree program provides one method of resolving that without having to go across multiple institutions potentially. But it's also a mechanism for multiple institutions to partner together at a lower cost.
Tevye here, and I'm glad to complicate it because I won't have to finish the discussion, I guess. But I do want to remember that, or put before the group, that it's not just the content of the program that impacts the capacity to move it online. It's also the access of the students to that information and the preparation of those students to engage within an online frame. So it's not just content that has to be considered. It has to be the students as well. And secondly, although on the face of it, it's easy to say it's more expensive to have a separate program at several institutions that's smaller enrollment, there are significant costs to the coordination that you just pointed out in a consortium that may actually play off against that as being if it's cost effectiveness we're looking at, it may actually not become more cost effective, which argues again, I think, for much of this decision to be the responsibility of the institution.
Unfortunately, it's our responsibility. We have to do it.
So, Tevye's here.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, I struggle with these things every day. So kind of to get back, so we've kind of seen a focus then on the practical programs versus the more face-to-face lecture-based, however we want to describe non-practical programs. Is there any way to further define that, or to identify the degree programs to which that would apply? Could we ask that maybe the community colleges identify those programs that are majority practical programs, so that we can at least use that as a basis for it?
You might want to address that to TACTI or to the WECM group. I think that would be the appropriate group to address that question too.
Fair enough.
And just saying that it's an application-based program, I'll give you an example of programming. I could probably do that online. That's a program that's very heavily application-based because you got to get your hands in, you got to get used to doing it. But of course, nursing, there's pieces of that you definitely want them in a clinical setting, or you don't want to get sick. So
that's the one I tried out.
You say that, Mark, but I have to tell you that nursing is the area that's going online the fastest, especially at the doctoral level. They're just going nuts with career schools are just enrolling nurses left, right, and center because they're online and available wherever. Granted, there's clinical components to it as well, but it's just exploding.
I agree. You also have to remember, too, in many of those programs, there's foundation skills that have already been gained before that. And then in distance ed's been my background for a while. And in those types of programs, a lot of instances, there are clinicals you do in your area. It doesn't matter where the program is offered, but you still have a clinical person out there monitoring what you're doing.
Absolutely, and another group is having fun figuring out all the clinical space around the state as well. That's a whole other story.
While we talk about online, and somebody hinted to it here, interactive video is a key piece, and you talked about the technology. Interactive video is a key piece for being able to pick up people at many different sites. And as the technology is getting better and better, you don't have those delays in the transmission and stuff. That's something that these consortiums really should be able to feed off of.
Yeah.
But that's something that you also need to give geographic consideration to, because the infrastructure is not the same all around the state.
You also have to look at the fact that when we're dealing with different geographical regions, particularly when we're looking at different student population bases, they may not have access to not only a campus but a computer, depending on how far away they are. First-generation Hispanic-serving institutions very commonly are dealing with the fact that these students do not have very much of anything coming into the scenario. And therefore, we need to make sure they still have an equal opportunity to receive the education that students in other parts of the state potentially have the same chances to do so.
So that goes back to how close is close enough. I mean, that's the question. Sol Ross, what's close enough? And we don't know the answer to that right now.
Simplistically, I don't think there's an answer to that. It's something that's going to be very variable depending on the nature of the population in the area, the programs that are available, and what the needs are for those communities, as well as for the state as a whole.
Yeah, as a general standard, I think that all you can use is, you may be able to arrive at something that says, we're looking at this program. But I really think that the programs need to have an opportunity to explain because you're getting into so many, specific kinds of considerations. Explain what is this, and do they have that opportunity at this time? I mean, do they, this is my unique situation, and then make a judgment. It's either a good argument or it isn't.
I echo what you're saying, David, because the good psychologist in me, the answer is always it depends. And I think that the onus of responsibility is, well, one, I don't really feel comfortable, putting together, a rule of thumb or guidelines that you're asking for. This is an uneasy and uncomfortable situation for myself. But the other thing is, as I listen to my colleagues, there are so many unique situations that I think need to be taken into account, that later on the onus of responsibility is then on us when we have a program. If you're going to say, okay, the number is 5 or 8 or whatever it is, to provide that justification, and for you then, I guess, to look at it, and for us to provide all the data that we can and say, look, we're an HSI, we're this many miles away from the nearest institution, we're one of only 2 institutions that does this, and those are the kinds of things that need to be given special consideration. That's the equitable thing to do. I mean, we don't want to create something that is, I think, imparted equally. I don't want to see something that is just imparted across the board the same. I want what's equitable.
And I believe me, I truly appreciate that, and you understand why we struggle with this, just because of the conversation we're having today. You all are struggling with it too, and I appreciate that, and I guess as much as anything, I wanted some empathy along the way, because we are struggling with it. I mean, it is a significant issue. It is a very important campus issue, and it is something that we recognize fully impacts students, especially at smaller institutions, at geographically separate institutions, and so we're trying to. We were really hoping for some help to take some of the guesswork out of it, and it's not guesswork. But there is a certain amount of subjectivity that plays into it. And as a former prosecutor, I'm not a big fan of that all the time. So as much as anything, getting your input and getting you all thinking about it kind of from our perspective, and understanding that, it is going to come down to being subjective because of these issues, because, we have a major chemical plant that needs, 5 chemists a year coming out, and we have a hard time recruiting them into our area of the state because of where we're located, and, it's better if we do it homegrown, and making some of those arguments. So, yes, ma'am.
We have kind of a unique situation, I guess. Our service area is 9,400 square miles, right on top of the Eagle Ford Shale. And we have some programs that have, in our workforce, that have absolutely died overnight. People come, they stay one semester in welding or drafting, and then they go away, and they're a complete failure to the state. The program's a complete failure to the coordinating board, but they're making $50 an hour. And they're a complete success as far as they're concerned with taking 1, 2, 3, or 4 courses. And, if we would kill the program, because we have 8 welders right now. They're all working. And we've had successful programs. If we kill these programs without looking at other outside factors, it may just be a little temporary bump in the road, then we've done some long-term damage, because trying to rebuild a program that you killed 5 years ago, and now it's time to start it again, it's really hard to do.
Is the answer that the institutions need to answer these things when they submit their package, and that's how the package needs to be laid out? Because I'm with what I heard.
If you guys aren't going to give me 100 miles, then yeah, I think we're going to have to answer these individually. So yes, I think the short answer is I think we're going to have to do more to ensure that the information we're getting about the programs does allow for the story to be told, and sometimes the cacophony of the stories gets difficult to distinguish. And so the more information that we have with regard to the specific nature of your unique program, the better off we are in terms of trying to do our analysis. And I've got a phenomenal staff. They do a great job, and they are very thoughtful and introspective people who are trying to do the right thing for your students and for the state. And so we're trying to do the right thing. We're not always going to make it. We're not always going to make the right decision. We're certainly not always going to make the right decision for your institution and from your institution's perspective. But that's why we've got to keep having these conversations, because we're not going to improve understanding better your perspective if we don't. And so I think continuing to try and address the unique nature of the programs and why we have to have this program even though it's only 30 miles away from the next closest program, and what distinguishes this program from that program, and why our students are different, why we're not able to recruit more. And that, if nothing else has come out of this, of the low producing program standards, I have been incredibly gratified by the number of faculty members who have truly stepped up and engaged and said, we haven't been doing our part to recruit more students and to ensure that we're retaining them, and we're going to do better. And that has been very gratifying, and that's been one of the things where we've seen, a lot of folks going, you know what, yeah, we dropped the ball. We weren't doing things well, but we've had the wake-up call. And so we're very, that's encouraging in terms of where we're going. And we recognize that it's not the same at every institution. It's not the same at every degree program within an institution. And so as we move forward, we just got to recognize there is a measure of subjectivity in this process. And as much as we would like it to be clean and crisp, we're not always going to be able to get there. And having the minimum standard at 2, 3, and 5 gives us something clean and crisp to start from. If we go above that, then I think looking at taking more of this into consideration and having the subjectivity play a larger measure in that conversation and in those decisions makes sense. But I hope you all will understand that we're going to try and hold to that clean and crisp 2, 3, and 5 as best we can, so that if we move to 3, 5, and 8, what we're looking at for all of these additional measures is the difference between 2, 3, and 5 and 3, 5, and 8. So that it's not, if we're at 2, 3, and 5, it's still the hard and fast line in the sand unless, the existing considerations are met. At 2, 3, and at 3, 5, and 8, then we begin to look at the broader perspective of what's the geographic availability, those kind of things. Because it's like a lot of things. There has to be a certain core number of students to have a program be viable. And if you've got one professor and a half of a part-time professor teaching every course in a full degree, is that really giving a good benefit to the student in terms of the viewpoints, in terms of the experience level, in terms of just the different instructional styles that may or may not be good for that student? And if you've got a student who doesn't do well with a certain instructional style, and that's the only style that's ever presented to them, they're not going to be successful no matter how big or small the program is. So, there's a lot of things to take into consideration. But anyway, I'll end my monologue by saying thank you. This conversation has been very helpful to me, and I do appreciate the time that we've taken to do it. Donna, Lucy, do you have anything? Donna, Catherine, Lucy, do you have anything to?
Any other comments for the?
Lucy's got.
I think McGregor, I don't want to go off on continue what McGregor said, but we as staff in evaluating these things, it's probably the toughest part of our year doing all of this. And we need your guidance on how we should best serve the state.
And just 2 cents, I guess. One of the things that almost always comes out at these meetings is that, and I think it's real useful, the staff really does have a state perspective, a statewide perspective that most of us kind of understand, but we don't practice it very often. And we don't practice it very often because it's not, we're trying to make our institutions work and so on and so forth. And I think it's good to bring the two perspectives together. But it is partly our job on UEAC to keep that in mind. And one of the things that, I don't want to complicate it any further, but one of the things that we do keep in mind at most of our institutions all the time is closing the gaps, and that's a state perspective, and these things impact that too in ways that probably we understand as well as anybody does, and so we need to keep that in mind too in terms of this complicated distance question and all of the other questions. How does it impact our ability to do that? And I may be overly sensitive to that right now because one of my jobs at my institution has to do with overseeing our retention efforts, and we get crosswise with enrollment management because their job is to get as many students on campus as humanly possible. And the number of students that are alternate admit keeps creeping up, and then the retention problem keeps getting worse. And the people who are above me say, well, gee, why isn't the retention percentage going up? And my answer is because we're doing, we have two things here that are running at cross purposes, and in fact we're wildly successful in that we're just keeping it where it is. They are very sympathetic to that argument, but what we get in our considerations often are similar sorts of things. In that, we want to be efficient, but we need to pay attention to what that might do to something like closing the gaps as well, and so and seek a balance. And I think that these kinds of conversations help us find where that is. But I do think that, in terms of the subjectivity question and in terms of the difficulties of, well, there's just a whole lot of variables that we can use some standards, but there has to be this other category that people can make an argument for their local unique characteristics. And we can trust the judgment of the coordinating board to take that into consideration and make a fair judgment about those things, as long as they have that opportunity to make those arguments. And I think most people are reasonable. If you make your argument and, others have a reason why we can't accept that argument, okay. But where we get into trouble, I think, and where we get hard feelings and feeling like we're being dictated to is when you really don't feel like you had the opportunity to make the case. So I hope we have enough, due process in a sense in that way. Okay. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Just for the sake of note-taking, what were the other two exemptions that we were not discussing but that have already been agreed upon? Somebody said there were 4 altogether, and geography and...
Well, geography, essential/critical fields are things we look at.
Those are 2.
If they're raised, what we currently look at is closing the gaps, how it pertains to closing the gaps, and any other coordinating board initiatives. And if it's made up, the second of those is if it's made up of courses used in other programs.
Oh, right, interdisciplinary.
Interdisciplinary, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, well, are we ready to talk about date for next meeting? And how do we talk about that?
How about if we kind of circle back and see where we are? Since that legislative session is coming up, that kind of changes our work plans. And so as we get into the spring semester, maybe we'll sit down and think about setting a timeline. If you all want to give us an idea of when the best general times are in the spring.
People tend to like to respond on Doodle, so what we can do, generally, historically this committee has preferred to meet on Fridays, with few exceptions. And so I might put together a Doodle poll that just asks if that is still the will of the committee. And we'll find some, one of the things that we have to deal with here is making sure that we have a place for you to meet. So that is another factor that we'll need to look at. But I think maybe we'll put together some dates and put out a Doodle poll and have you respond that way.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn? All in favor?
I would also just like to thank those people who are rotating off the committee today because they have served remarkably and have worked really diligently on the core curriculum and a broad variety of other issues that we've thrown at this committee. And the input that they've given us has been invaluable. So I just want to thank, I know Larry has left, but Danny and Celia, and I'm looking around to see who else is here who's rotating off. But I just want to say to every single one of you, thank you so much, because this is a joy for me. One of the things I love the most about this job is working with you guys, and I really, really appreciate you.